Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus, and today we're going over Chapter 5 of Whipping Girl. I am not feeling up to trying to set up everything and dealing with light and shit, so we're going to have a Sean-inspired episode today, which is fine by me, because I imagine not many people are actually watching me talk, especially in these episodes. In addition, here's my usual disclaimer. We are reading a book that was written in 2005, published in 2007. It does use some outdated terminology compared to what we would say for today, such as cissexual over cisgender. And this is written as a book to talk about Julia Serrano's personal experience with transitioning and trying to apply it as a greater whole to the transgender, but specifically trans femme experience. And this chapter does better than any other at really highlighting that. And I also want to once again mention I am reading this from the perspective of someone who is coming into it 15 years later, knows Julia Serrano is the one that coined transmisogyny, and until recently had held her in a very high regard. Currently, I am very bitter towards her and I don't like what she's been saying, but I am still trying to go into each chapter as good faith as possible. So, usual way we're going, I'm going to read you my review of the chapter and then we will go through point by point. I do want to warn, at one point we are going to be discussing David Reamer, and if you're not familiar with his name, you will be, but I will be disclosing particular trigger warnings around his story, as well as trying to post timestamps so that you can avoid those trigger warnings, because it is an extremely sad, depressing story. So, my notes for the entire chapter is weird chapter. It doesn't feel aimed at me so much as cisgender people out there needing to dismantle their own internalized transphobia. I once again balk at the fact she's using her personal experiences and ascribing them to all trans experiences with her newly minted language, making me all the more glad things like subconscious or conscious sex hasn't really caught on. I'm also, as someone who genuinely didn't have any conscious cognitive dissonance about their gender identity until they were in college, baffled at why she feels that she only learned she didn't see herself as a boy until she was 5, is actually all that different from the mainstream story being told all the time. It was in fact these stories that made me question if I was actually trans. As Nature Made Him came up, and I'm actually really glad I stole that book from my mom, and I'll get into that more when the footnote that is talking about it comes up. I do agree and I fully understand the mental breakdown that occurs when one is highly dysphoric and running out of options to deal with their dysphoria. Once again, though, the way she talks about certain aspects of this breakdown, as well as how she talks about cisgender and non-binary identities in this chapter, feels very holier than thou and dismissive to other very valid identities. The only thing I'm really happy about in this chapter is she has chosen to focus her ire on cis people instead of trans, masc, or non-binary identities for once. Even though she does bring up NB identities, and even that kind of is incongruent with how she's been talking about non-binary people in the previous chapters. It really makes me question how each chapter was written. Were they written like all at once, all together, or, as I feel just reading these things, were they like a bunch of different little mini essays that she then put together because she thought they were close enough and didn't bother going through to see if the overarching narrative and thoughts about certain things were actually congruent with each other? Now for the chapter title. This is chapter 5, Blind Spots, on subconscious sex and gender entitlement. And I will be doing quite a bit of reading because most of this is something I agree with, but I still want to give you the full context as I discuss my feelings around these excerpts. Starting with the very first paragraph. One of the most frustrating aspects about being a transsexual is that I'm frequently asked to explain to other people why I decided to transition. Why did I feel it necessary to physically change my body? How could I possibly know that I'd be happier as a woman when I had only ever experienced being male? If I don't believe that women and men are opposite sexes, then why change my sex at all? Unfortunately, while these are among the most common questions people ask, they are also the ones to which people are the least open to hearing my answer. After having fielded these sorts of questions from my friends and family at high school and college classes where I've been invited to speak, and from fellow queers and feminists with whom I've shared discussions about gender, I've come to the conclusion that most cis-sexuals have a particular blind spot at the source of their seemingly endless curiosity, and often doubt about how someone who is born into a certain physical sex can come to know themselves as a member of the other sex. This blind spot has to do with what has commonly been called gender identity. Personally, I have always found the term gender identity to be rather misleading. After all, identifying as something, whether it be a woman, Democrat, Christian, feminist, cat person, or a metalhead, seems to be a conscious, deliberate choice on our part, one that we have to make in order to better describe how we think we fit into the world. Thus, with regard to transsexuals, the phrase gender identity is problematic because it seems to describe two potentially different things: the gender we consciously choose to identify as, and the gender we subconsciously feel ourselves to be. To make things clear, I will refer to the latter as subconscious sex. The main reason I make this distinction between gender identity and subconscious sex is that it best explains my own personal experiences. I did not have the quintessential trans experience of always feeling that I should have been female. For me, this came about more gradually. The first memories I have of being trans took place early in my elementary years when I was around 5 or 6. So, I'm ending that there. That's literally like the first 2.25 paragraphs. So, what are my feelings around this? Well, yes, I do agree with her that cisgender people and binary trans people in particular kind of have a gender blind spot in trying to understand why people may choose quote unquote identify as the opposite sex or a non-binary sex, that sort of thing. I think Julia Serrano herself has a massive blind spot, as we've discussed in previous chapters, where she has talked about subconscious sex and the idea of non-binary or gender fluid identities being a partial realization of the subconscious sex. And my issues really stem from the idea of gender identity being problematic. That may be me reading into this as 15 years later and how gender identity has sort of evolved as a useful term. Because I do agree with points that one's subconscious sex, what you see yourself in your brain to be, whether or not that aligns with your physical body, is not so much of a choice, but I do think it is a choice in how you express it. And that just gets really complicated because your gender identity encompasses the idea of gender expression. It's very broad. So I can't go into that without ending up dissecting everything else. And honestly, I don't have the mental bandwidth to do that. So this may be a topic for a different video where I break down what gender identity is and how it is congruent and also different from the idea of Serrano's subconscious sex. But I really find myself annoyed because she's once again being disingenuous. She has mentioned how she doesn't see female and male as very distinct, even though in the very last chapter I absolutely lost my shit because she was being a bioessentialist by saying that testosterone and estrogen have these very serious inalterable effects on the body and the mind and all of that stuff. She's basically a biological gender essentialist, and then she comes into this chapter and she's like, oh, they're not all that different. Also, as I mentioned in my summary of thoughts, the fact that she's talking about, I'm not like other trans women. I didn't start having any cognitive dissonance about my gender identity until I was around 5 or 6. It feels very misleading because, yes, at the time, it was a very common argument that transgender and transsexual people were born and have always been aware that they weren't like the cis counterparts that they grew up with. But when you actually look at stories and look at how they're broken down, you see the Oh, I started realizing this when I was like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, da da da, very, very young. And she herself is saying, I was consciously aware by the time I was 5 or 6 that people saw me as a boy, but I didn't really see myself as a boy. She also, jumping down, mentions, I wasn't sure what to make of these feelings at the time. After all, I was obviously a boy. Everybody thought so. And unlike other MTF spectrum children, I never really wanted to take part in girlish activities such as playing house. Being that, like most elementary school children, my understanding of girl and boy was largely based on gender preferences and toys, activities, and interests, it wasn't clear to me how to reconcile my vague subconscious feelings with my passion for dinosaurs and my desire to be a Major League Baseball player when I grew up. It wasn't until I was the age of 11 that I consciously recognized these subconscious feelings as an urge or desire to be female. And again, I'm someone who did not realize he was trans until I was 19. I did have some cognitive dissonance and a lot of discomfort with my body, but I thought it was normal for women to be uncomfortable with their body. I find myself reading her experiences with the cognitive dissonance and gender dissonance growing up, and it sounds very much like any stereotypical story. Maybe not so stereotypical nowadays, now that transgender identity is more commonly known, and a lot of children are encouraged to experiment and figure out what's comfortable with them. And that's only a net positive for everyone involved. But that is also a very recent process. Like, when I first realized I was trans in the early 2010s, that was not something that was very common. I would imagine that the children that started being allowed to have sort of this gender experimentation might have been conceived around the time that I started coming to terms with my own transgender identity. Hopping down a bit, talking about how she would see herself as being a girl and that sort of thing, to trying to translate these subconscious experiences into conscious thought is a messy business, to which I don't disagree. All of the words available in the English language completely fail to accurately capture or convey my personal understandings of these events. For example, if I were to say that I saw myself as female or knew myself to be a girl, I would be denying the fact that I was consciously aware of my physical maleness at all times. And saying that I wished or wanted to be a girl erases how much being female made sense to me, how it felt right on the deepest, most profound level of my being. I could say that I felt like a girl, but that would give the false impression that I knew how other girls and other boys felt. And if I were to say that I was supposed to be a girl or that I should have been born female, it would imply that I had some sort of cosmic insight into the grand scheme of the universe, which I most certainly did not. This entire paragraph is just pretentious to me. While I understand the want to have the accurate language for what you're experiencing, the dismissal of the language that is commonly used around transgender identity and discussion is incredibly hollow and completely ignores the flexibility of the human language to convey emotion and thought. When you say, I wished or wanted to be a girl, we know that you feel correct in that you are a woman, that you are female. It's not undermining it. And talking about how you felt like a girl doesn't mean that you automatically assume everyone else's experiences. Yes, there are some stupid people out there that say, oh, you feel like a girl, but clearly you don't know how it is because of me, that sort of thing. But those people tend to be narrow minded and won't be interested in nuanced discussion anyway. So that entire paragraph is not only unnecessary, but it it reads very much like the rest of the book, where she's grandstanding these ideas and forcing her opinion on the greater language that is still being used to this day. So before we continue, the next bit is going to go over the book that I talked about earlier, As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised a Girl, published in 2000. And this chapter, this section, is going to be extremely serious as it talks about sexual assault of minors and forced genital surgery to an infant and forced HRT and that sort of thing, as well as brief mentions of mental illness and the inevitable conclusion to David Raymer's life, where he committed suicide at the age of 38. Once again, I urge you guys to be aware of your own mental health and skip this part. There's not really anything here that I'm going to disagree with Serrano on, but I feel discussing this is important, and I will be discussing a bit of my personal relationship with David Raymer's story as well. So, Serrano brings up The Boy Who Was Raised a Girl as an annotation to this part that I will read now. For example, there have been numerous instances in which male infants have been surgically reassigned as female after birth due to botched circumcisions or coloacal extrophy, a non-intersex medical condition. Despite being raised female and appearing to have female genitals, the majority of such children eventually come to identify as male, demonstrating that brain sex may override both socialization and genital sex. And she has a footnote that links to this book. And I had a feeling, because this book was published in 2000, that it would come up in some way. And I was correct. So I read As Nature Made Him between the ages of 14 and 16, because this was right before I started getting really heavily into apologetics. And this book was honestly the first brush I had with transgender identities, and I didn't even realize it. I wasn't supposed to read it, but I did. My mom didn't want me to read this or A Child Called It or A Million Little Pieces because they were extremely heavy books about abuse and addiction and forced sexual reassignment surgery. What I find haunting is that while A Million Little Pieces and A Child Called It have been scrutinized a bit as being a little bit sensationalistic and blurring reality with fiction, I haven't noticed any substantial claims about As Nature Made Him. So let's talk about David Ramey. David was born in 1965 as the elder of two twin boys. When they were 6 months old, it was noticed that they weren't urinating properly. It turns out that they were uncircumcised and their foreskin was not pulling back from the glands properly for them to urinate. It was decided that they would be scheduled for circumcision, and the infant David, at 7 months old, was first up. They went with an unusual method of circumcision, and it actually irreparably hurt his penis. It was burned beyond surgical repair. The parents were understandably concerned about David's prospects in the future, especially since he wouldn't have a penis for sexual function. They eventually took him to the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore to see a psychologist, John Money, who is, at the time, he was known for being a pioneer in the field of sexual development and gender identity, specifically with his work on intersex patients. Money thought that gender identity was primarily through socialization and genitals, and he encouraged the parents to give David a sex change as an infant. So that's what they did. They started raising David as a girl. And Money would make very positive cases and talked about him and his twin, thinking that they were the perfect example as David's twin was able to get the urination problem cleared up without surgery, so he was able to live as a cisgender boy, while his twin brother was raised as a presumably cisgender girl. And all of this was like, oh, everything's going great. We have perfect control. Money was super excited and writing all these positive case notes until David found out at 14 the truth, and he started transitioning back to being a male. He had been given female hormones, and so he ended up getting a double mastectomy as well as phalloplasty, and he chose the name David for himself. It also came out that John Money was sexually abusing David and his twin, where they were forced to undress and take on the roles of sexual partners and sort of mime having sexual acts. If this reminds you of any of the stuff that the German Nazi twin experiments did, that's what it reminds me of, and that's what it reminded me of back then as well. David eventually married, adopted 3 children, but after the story came out and he put his name to the experiments, and after his wife left him, he ended up committing suicide at the age of 38. It is also important to mention that his twin at some point developed schizophrenia. So nobody in this family really escaped unscathed. This story honestly traumatized me as a child, and this story is why I do agree at some deep level that someone's gender identity is hard-coded into their mind and body. I believe that gender identity, regardless of how innate it is 100% formed by social expectations of those gender identities. But I do believe that there are people whose identities are so firmly rooted in their mind that it cannot be changed. And David's story is something that has stuck with me since I was a child. So, getting away from that, I welcome back everyone who decided to skip over that. It's really depressing to talk about. Going back to Serrano's stuff, I highlighted another paragraph that is basically talking about how she believes that the brain hardwiring hypothesis of gender identity, which is something that got touched on in the previous part, is something that is very much proven to her, and I'm not fully disinclined to disagree, because I do believe that there are some gender identities that are so strongly rooted in the mind, that sort of thing. And she mentions how she would try to masturbate, as is more typical with women and young girls, or she would have dreams about being a girl, that sort of thing. So I can see how it is affirming to her to see stories about how people's brains are hardwired to be a certain gender and have that validate her own experiences in gender identity. Moving on, we get a little into her own process and coming to terms with her gender identity, where she mentions, as time went on, I latched onto all sort of other gender identities and theories that seemed to hold potential explanations for my subconscious feelings. For quite a while, I thought of myself as a cross-dresser and viewed my female subconscious sex as a feminine side that was trying to get out. But after years of cross-dressing, I eventually lost interest in it. realizing that my desire to be female had nothing to do with clothing or femininity per se. There was also a period of time when I embraced the word pervert and viewed my desire to be female as some sort of sexual kink. But after exploring that path, it became obvious that explanation could not account for the vast majority of instances when I thought about being female in a non sexual context. And after reading Kate Bornstein's and Leslie Finberg's writings for the first time, I embraced the words transgender and queer. I began to think of myself as bigendered, viewing my female subconscious sex as being just as legitimate as my physical maleness. In the years just prior to my transition, I started to express my femaleness as much as possible within the context of having a male body. I became a very androgynous queer boy in the eyes of the world. While it felt relieving to simply be myself, not to care about what other people thought of me, I still found myself grappling with a constant, compelling subconscious knowledge that I should be female rather than male. After 20 years of exploration and experimentation, I eventually reached the conclusion that my female subconscious sex had nothing to do with gender roles, femininity, or sexual expression. It was about the personal relationship I had with my own body. And I highlighted that part mostly to read to you as an explanation for this entire book and how she's come to the conclusions that she has. She is ascribing this experience of transition from seeing herself as a male to realizing she had some sort of femaleness and trying to express that femaleness to realizing that she was and is a woman, and the only thing that could really help her in the long run is to transition physically and be seen as a woman. She is ascribing that journey to every other person who chooses to go under the trans umbrella. Maybe she didn't mean it to come across that way, but the way that her work has been used since it was published, that is the end result. And how she currently acts online using words like TME, TMA, that sort of thing, and actually putting her significant social weight behind those terms, it feels like she still very much is ascribing these experiences purposefully across non-binary and transmasculine experiences, as well as trans femme experiences that don't match with what she saw in herself. I highlighted another part where she mentions, when I made the decision to transition, I honestly had no idea what it'd be like for me to live as female. The only thing I knew for sure was that pretending to be male was slowly killing me. As someone who also put off his transition for a very long time, I completely see where she's coming from. Admittedly, I didn't have a 20-year wait, but I also have a lot less mental fortitude, I would imagine, compared to her. There is some talk about gender bias and how the transphobia that is experienced from cisgender people is a lot similar to the homophobia that lesbians and gay people would experience from people in the 60s and 70s, as well as biphobia even coming from queer people themselves. And I highlight it. I have also met some people in the trans community who feel that identifying outside of the male-female binary is superior to or more enlightened than identifying within it. Such people often express gender anxiety, binary phobia, at people who identify strongly as either female or male. So then she is like, oh, all types of gender is valid, that sort of thing, talking about all of that shit. But once again, we have a very telling reading of the non-binary and genderqueer community. So she really does not like non-binary identities. Then scooping on down, because most people have not come to terms with their own subconscious sex and its relation to their physical sex, they tend to experience unwarranted distress regarding sex/gender variant bodies. Many people who say they favor trans rights tend to balk when it means that they have to share a locker room or public shower with a transsexual. And plenty of people are supportive of their trans friends and colleagues, but hypocritically would be disturbed if the person they were dating, sleeping with, or partnered to were to come out to them as trans. It is high time for gender anxious cissexuals to look within themselves and ask why they choose to view transsexual bodies as unsettling or disturbing. How can they consider a physical body to be attractive or innocuous when it is assumed to be a cissexual, then suddenly find it horrific or threatening upon the discovery that it is transsexual? And if such a dramatically different response can be elicited by the same human being under different circumstances, doesn't that indicate that the real difference resides in the cissexual mind and not in the transsexual body? Once again, I find myself agreeing and disagreeing with her there, because I do understand where she's coming from with the idea of allies being uncomfortable with bodies that aren't the same physical sex but being the same gender sharing their space. That is something that people need to work through. The inherent, oh, this person has a penis and they are in a woman's only space. I am uncomfortable even though I know intellectually this person is a woman because they have told me that they are a woman. And that is something that's just very hard to work through, especially in today's day and age where it's so much easier to fall down the turf pipeline. However, I do have some disagreement where, say, you are in a relationship and you come out as transgender, and your partner does not, even though they are very much fully for trans rights and that sort of thing, they are allowed to need the time to process their own emotions towards that. Say you are a lesbian, for instance, and your partner comes out as a trans man. There is this sudden dissonance of being raised in the lesbian movement, where today's day and age it's very much a political identity and not just a sexual orientation. You have suddenly found yourself in the position where you are interacting with a man. If you are the sort of person who is able to see your partner as the gender they are expressing themselves to be. And depending on how long you've been in that relationship, it may take you some time. We talk in therapy in different queer groups how trans identities can be extremely hard on the people around them, especially people who have lived with them or supported them or raised them. And even the most accepting parents, spouses, children, siblings can be, you have to give them an adjustment period. And there's also the very real, you can 100% support your spouse transitioning, but you find yourself losing attraction to them with the thought that they are going to transition to something and you don't know if you're going to be comfortable with it. Yes, there's a lot that needs to be unlearned, but just saying this is inherently a problem with them and nothing is wrong with the trans person if they refuse to like not accept it, that sort of thing, it's just so disingenuous in my opinion. People are allowed to choose to express their gender identity however they see fit. I am not saying that. I am not saying put yourself in the closet for someone else. I am saying it's good to give people time to adjust. And sometimes when you start changing, your spouse, your partner, they might find themselves not in love with you anymore. Because let's face it, if you choose to transition hormonally, you end up changing. You're going through a different puberty. You are yourself. You are yourself. But who you were was not your complete self. And who you were is who they fell in love with. They didn't realize that they were falling in love with an incomplete package. I know I get really defensive of cishet people, but I guess that's just because I get really tired of seeing how much the trans community chooses to hate them. Because it's understandable, we have been traumatized by this group of people who have power over us. But they're just people too. really, I think that's what gets me at the end of this day. At the end of the day, about this book is Serrano is so eager to put her own stamp on everything, to ascribe her experience as a universal one, that she ends up demonizing people who should and can be our allies. So, that's the end of this chapter. I apologize if it's not as well put together as my previous episodes, my previous videos. Fortunately, I've woken up a lot since I started recording, so I'm going to edit this with a clear mind. But that's about it. So, let me know what you think. Am I being a little too hard on Serrano here? Am I being a little too easy on cisgender people who find themselves in relationships with trans people? I don't know. It's hard for me to be unbiased about this. But yeah, I love y'all for sticking with me. And thank you so much. So, y'all stay hydrated, stay healthy. Don't take too much of your medication because, Lord, that was a bad idea. And I'll talk to y'all tomorrow. Bye.